A Triumph of Surgery by James Herriot. James Alfred White. James Alfred White, 3 October 1916 to 23 February 1995, known by the pen name James Herriot, was a British veterinary surgeon and writer. Born in Sunderland, England, White lived in Glasgow during his childhood and teenage years. After graduating from Glasgow Veterinary College in 1939, White moved back to England and was a veterinarian in the Yorkshire Dales for almost 50 years. He is best known for writing a series of 8 books set in the 1930s to 1950s, Yorkshire Dales, about animals and their owners, which began with If Only They Could Talk, first published in 1970. Tricky, a small dog, is pampered and overfed by his rich mistress. He falls seriously ill and his mistress consults a veterinary surgeon. Does he perform an operation? Does the dog recover? Let's read the text and find out. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead and his tongue lolled from his jaws. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain, "He was so listless, Mr. Herriot. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition, so I have been giving him some extras between meals to build him up, some malt and cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much, really." So here, children, you can see that Tricky is a very pampered dog of Mrs. Pumphrey, and she has made the dog so fat with all of the stuff she has been giving to him. Now she meets Dr. Herriot on the way, and he is shocked seeing the condition of the dog. Let's continue. "And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you?" "Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak I had to relent. He does love cream cakes and chocolates so I can't bear to refuse him." I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. So here the doctor is worried that the dog is being overfed with cream cakes, chocolates, as Mrs. Pumphrey is telling him. And what was the only problem with the dog? That he was very greedy. He never refused food. And Mrs. Pumphrey must have been hiding something from the doctor too. "Are you giving him plenty of exercise?" "Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see, but Hodgkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there has been no ring throwing lately." So as the gardener, Hodgkin, was down with lumbago recently, the dog wasn't having any ring throwing lately, and according to Mrs. Pumphrey, he was having his little walks with his mistress. I tried to sound severe. "Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right now and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet." So the doctor, Mr. Herriot, tried to explain Mrs. Pumphrey that the dog really needs exercise immediately, or the poor creature will fall ill." Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. "Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you are right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult." She set off, head down, along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. So Mrs. Pumphrey heard what Mr. Harriet had told her. She wrung her hands. She thought deeply. She told the doctor that she will take care, and she moved on. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats, for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. "So you see, children, Tricky is such a pampered little dog of Mrs. Pumphrey. He has a whole wardrobe of different coats that he wears in different seasons." And looking at him, the doctor thought that it wouldn't be long before Mrs. Pumphrey would call him again, because Tricky was going to be seriously ill soon. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting. Didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. So the dog falls seriously ill within a few days and refuses to do anything. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. So Dr. Harriet was already prepared for Tricky's illness. He suggested that the dog be hospitalized and kept under observation for some time. The poor lady almost swooned. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and, followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. So the doctor immediately took the dog without delay, and as Mrs. Pumphrey started crying, the doctor still took the dog and put him inside the car. The entire staff was roused, and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. So everybody got busy collecting all the stuff that Tricky had. And as the doctor drove off with the dog, all the staff, along with Mrs. Pumphrey, started crying. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. "Poor old lad," I said. "You haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you." At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So as Tricky reaches the surgery or the treatment center, he is put down with other dogs which were already there. All of them try to get introduced to this new member. I made up a bed for him in a warm loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. So, slowly, Tricky starts taking interest in his surroundings. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. So here we can see that Tricky is starting to mingle with other dogs, which is a good sign. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong rush, followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. So see, children, here Tricky is not treated with any of the medicines, but when he mingles with other dogs, he discovers the joys of being a normal dog. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. So his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, was worried about him all the time and kept ringing at the surgery to get the latest news about the dog. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast, but when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. So you see, Tricky was not only given a lot of food, he was also given wine to build up his strength. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. So the wine sent for Tricky was actually consumed by the doctor and his friend. We could hardly believe it that the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. So it did not stop at that. Brandy was also sent for the dog. For a few nights the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. They were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. So the doctor was really having the time of his life, keeping Tricky at the surgery. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog has recovered and was awaiting collection. So after a fortnight, the doctor called Mrs. Pumphrey and told her that the dog was okay. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriot, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" "Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." So Mrs. Pumphrey came there in her gleaming black car to receive her loving dog. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretched out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. So Tricky had become very healthy now. He had lost all his fat and was playing joyfully with all the other dogs when the doctor came to take him. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. So the dog became so happy, he jumped from the doctor's arms to Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "ooh," and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. So even the dog was very happy seeing his mistress. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriot," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." So without any operation or medicine, Tricky recovers and the story gets a happy ending.